Hello and welcome to Pay Attention interviews about truth in troubling times. I'm here again with Elizabeth Voss from the Consortium News. And Elizabeth Voss is an independent journalist who writes for Consortium News. And she's covered the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell story, the Russiagate fiasco, which we're talking about today, and the extradition hearing of Julian Assange, which is going on in London now, as well as many aspects of Assange's case and history. She has, in fact, I believe, just stepped away from the Assange hearing in order to speak with us today, and I'm very grateful for that, and I'm grateful to talk with her again for many reasons. But one is to thank her personally for the interview on Epstein-Maxwell, which we are offering free online. And we used that interview today to launch Pay Attention interviews. And so we used it to launch the series. I'm very happy for that. And thanks for doing that one so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me on.
And today we're actually going to talk about something quite different. But Elizabeth actually taught me something about discerning the truth in listening to media, and especially listening through the cover-ups and the distortions in the news and in mainstream media. Sometimes, as in the case of the Epstein-Maxwell story, we can actually ferret out important truths by noting what's been left out. In the Epstein case, what was notably left out of all media accounts was Epstein's employment by intelligence agencies in the US and Israel. In other words, his connection to intelligence and his involvement in intelligence actually protected him and was very key to what was happening. And that's still left out of pretty much all the media accounts. So this key element in understanding what happened in that case was pretty much something that Elizabeth brought out for me. And perhaps most important in that was that Alexander Acosta, who was the Secretary of Labor under Trump, actually said in a press interview in Florida when he was explaining why he had given Epstein such a light sentence in his first arrest by federal authorities, that Epstein was actually connected to intelligence. And when you understand why that fact was omitted in the media reports, then you can understand a lot about what happened to Epstein, why he was so protected in the child sex trafficking, and why he eventually had to die, whether it was suicide or homicide. So we covered all of that in our last interview, but there's an analogous setup in the Russiagate situation. Important facts have been left out of the mainstream reports about the Trump-Russia affair. Just to get our conversation going, let me quote from Ray McGovern's August 21st, that's August 21st, 2020, piece in Consortium News. And this was McGovern's review of the Senate report on the Mueller investigation. McGovern announces in this review, he says, quote, "The hacking of the DNC charge by the Democrats suffered a fatal blow 3 months ago when it became known that Sean Henry, president of the DNC hired cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike, admitted under oath that his firm had no evidence that the DNC emails were hacked by Russia or anyone else." That testimony was given in December 2017. It was suppressed by Adam Schiff, chair of the Intelligence Committee, until May 7th, 2020. Schiff and others were able to suppress that information for 3 years. Now here's a sample of what Sean Henry said in 2017. He said, "We just don't have the evidence that any data actually left." Well, why don't we know this? And why don't we know this still? We still hear Democrats particularly getting a lot of press saying the DNC emails were hacked by the Russians and then given to WikiLeaks. Well, that did not happen. And of course, Julian Assange has said as much in his interview with John Pilger. But most important, CrowdStrike testified that it did not happen. So now we're in the midst of this presidential election season. And I want to make clear that a lot of what we're going to say today impacts on the election season, but I have no affiliation with either of our major political parties. I believe that they're both corrupt and non-transparent. So my interest in the Trump-Russia affair is not political. Instead, it involves my deep worry about how the general public is being set up by the government, the CIA, and technology companies to have a particular view of Russia and Putin at a time when the US is involved in at least 3 wars with Russia. And we'll talk about this in depth as we move through the interview. So that's a pretty long introduction, but welcome back, Elizabeth. So very happy to have you here. And
yeah, it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have loaded on such a big framing of this interview, but I actually think without a really involved framing, people won't know why I'm doing it and why I'm doing it right now, which is, I think it's very important to see these pieces of information at the time that the Assange hearing is going on, and also at the time that the presidential election season is on. So first, let's talk about how the investigation into the alleged Trump-Russia connection got going within the mainstream media, the Democratic establishment, and our intelligence agencies. Beginning in 2016, we were led to think that Russian intelligence hacked into John Podesta's emails and that those were then published by WikiLeaks. In 2016, the late Robert Perry, who was the founder of Consortium News, wrote, "While lacking any verifiable proof, Clinton's campaign and its allied mainstream media have blamed Russian intelligence for hacking in to the Democratic National Committee's emails and then publishing them through WikiLeaks. This conspiracy theory holds that Putin is trying to influence the US election to put his secret agent, Donald Trump, into the White House." And that's the end of the quote. And I just want to note that Robert Perry was a political progressive, by the way, if people wonder what his politics were. So could you help us sort through these diverse threads first in the story? That's the Podesta emails, WikiLeaks, stirring up a suspicion of Russia and Putin, keeping Trump from being elected, and now at least that was the goal. And now finally, with this recent Senate report on the Mueller investigation, egging Americans on in thinking that Russia is once again taking over our elections. So here's the order that I'd like to talk about, and we will be putting this up on the screen. Number 1, the DNC email leak hack, the Guccifer 2.0 persona as the Russian hacker. Number 2, Seth Rich, the employee of the DNC who was murdered and has been suspected by some people of leaking the DNC emails. Number 3, the contents of the Podesta emails. 4, the accusations of WikiLeaks. 5, suspicions about Putin and Russia. 6, keeping Trump from being elected and re-elected. And then 7, renewing these suspicions now through the Senate report on the Mueller investigation. So it's a whole line of thinking. I'm sure you know a lot about it. I know you've written a lot about it. And if you could take us through that line, I'll ask you questions as we go along, but please just kind of go through the logic.
Sure. I guess I'll start with the first section and just say that, I totally understand you're having to kind of have a very long introduction on this subject. And that's really an emblem of the confusion around the whole Russiagate story. And it seems to me that, first of all, confusion and layers upon layers of conflicting stories is something that it serves in this story the way that lies of omission served in the Epstein story. So instead of just, kind of burying something completely, it's basically so confused and so complex that people basically just throw up their hands and go with whatever explanation that maybe seems either politically expedient or seems to come from the highest authority, whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, or other elements of the legacy press. So that's the first thing. And secondly, my interest in general in Russiagate came from after watching the DNC emails and the Podesta emails released by WikiLeaks, and the content of those emails showing that basically that Sanders had essentially been cheated from the 2016 Democratic Party presidential nomination, and then watching the Democratic Party pivot and basically deflect from that story and the content of the emails by claiming it had been hacked by the Russian government, by claiming that Russia was, cheated Hillary from the presidential win, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that history is important before we dive into all of this. And first of all, I don't know if you have any specific questions about Guccifer 2 as a Russian hacker or this DNC email leak / hack, but the first thing to say is that there's a very important timeline, a very important chronology when it comes to Guccifer 2, the publication of the DNC emails, and specifically the Russian hacking allegations. And that is that on June 12th of 2016, Julian Assange stated that that WikiLeaks had emails relating to Hillary Clinton that it would publish that were new. Prior to this, WikiLeaks had reorganized and had collated the infamous Hillary server emails and the State Department emails from Hillary Clinton. But separately, they were saying on June 12th, we have new Hillary Clinton related emails that we will publish. 2 days later, on June 14th, 2016, the Washington Post publishes allegations for the first time from Debbie Wasserman Schultz specifically that the DNC had been hacked by Russia, and that the hack constituted the theft of an opposition report on Trump. And this opposition report was then published on June 15th by Guccifer 2 on a WordPress blog site. And funnily enough, that specific document was what would then later have found the Cyrillic quote-unquote Russian fingerprints in that document. That's the document that was seized upon by the press to say, oh, look, Russia hacked the DNC. Here's the fingerprints. This is persona is this, and also kind of set up this idea that Russia and Guccifer 2 was then the source for WikiLeaks. The ongoing press coverage of the entire issue heavily conflated Guccifer 2 with WikiLeaks, to the point that even people who were critical of Russiagate would say that the debunking of Guccifer 2 as a Russian hacker meant that the WikiLeaks publications were also proven to be a leak and not a hack, when they are two separate, very separate publications. So,
could you tell us just a moment about
Sure.
Guccifer 2, what, where that document was first released, and what the background of that is, just before we move forward?
Sure.
And I'm glad you're pointing out this timeline, because it's very important.
Right. And so basically you have on June 15th, Guccifer 2 publishes his WordPress site, and he initially publishes, and I say he just for convenience, but it's a persona. We don't know who or what individual person or what group of people kind of were the authors and the creators of this persona. But basically Guccifer 2 publishes this Trump opposition report that was allegedly hacked from the DNC. The problem with that is that it is actually an attachment from a Podesta email. So it didn't even come from the DNC in the first place. So that, but to go back to Guccifer 2 as a persona, basically, again, June 15th, he publishes this WordPress blog. He would go on to publish more documents allegedly hacked from the DNC. However, the evidence as it stands, which was analyzed by, not only the veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity and their very, very, highly prestigious members and co-founders, including NSA technical director, former NSA technical director, Bill Binney, but also by anonymous analysts who came up with some evidence-based, verifiable analysis that showed that, first of all, the Trump opposition report and the Cyrillic error messages embedded within it would have had to have been, very likely would have had to have been intentionally created, that it would be exceptionally unusual, very difficult to have those error messages show up accidentally, and that in fact that report was one of the very few documents that would have been able to be formatted in such a way that it could display those error messages. So it seems to have been selected specifically, not only so that it could create the error messages, but because it didn't harm the DNC or Clinton, it actually harmed Trump instead. But Guccifer 2 in general, it seems the angle that Guccifer takes, whether it's in the Trump opposition report publication or other actions that Guccifer took, for example, telling actress Robin Young that Seth Rich was his source, it seems to have been preemptive attempt to muddy the waters around WikiLeaks' publications that they had announced on June 12th. And even in contradicting its own claims of having hacked the DNC by saying, oh, Seth Rich, well, it was a source and maybe it was leaked, what that does is it tries to say, well, in case Assange or WikiLeaks basically affirm that Seth Rich is a source, then we want to muddy the waters around that too, and preemptively make sure that any form of this, of confirmation of the source of these emails is tied in some way to this Guccifer 2 persona, and therefore tied to this Russian hacking narrative.
So did Guccifer 2 bring out the Seth Rich idea before that became, I mean, what was the timing on that? When did Guccifer 2 bring in the name Seth Rich as a potential leaking of the DNC emails?
Sure. So we have this June 15th initial publication of the Trump opposition report, which is prior to the July publication of the DNC emails by WikiLeaks, and also almost a month prior to just under a month prior to the death of Seth Rich on July 10th. On August 9th, so almost a month later, Julian Assange went on Dutch television and brought Seth Rich up on Dutch television unprompted, implying in many people's view that Seth Rich was a WikiLeaks source. When confronted with the interviewer, he basically kind of said, well, I'm not going to confirm sources, but when a young staffer is shot down like this, our multiple WikiLeaks sources become concerned. And on the same day, WikiLeaks offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to a conviction in Seth Rich's murder. So I say all that to give the context for the statement by Guccifer 2 to Robin Young that Seth Rich was a source, because it occurred right in that time period that Assange came on Dutch TV. I believe within a few days of Assange making those statements on Dutch TV, that sort of implied that, and those who were watching may have surmised that it was a strong possibility that Assange might confirm that source, although that did not happen.
Right. But then in an interview later, he made it clear that the emails were not hacked. I mean, he did say directly they were leaked and not hacked. Right. Now, what do you think about, or can you bring us up to date on what's happened in regard to the Seth Rich murder, or any understanding of what that narrative is?
Sure. And it's a huge narrative. But I think the thing is to remember that, again, within the Russiagate scandal and within the Russiagate narrative, the Seth Rich issue is probably the most highly censored, in my opinion, of all of the facets of this case. Basically, the investigation, I believe, is still open, but there's been no progress in the murder investigation of Seth Rich. Again, he was killed on July 10th. He was gunned down in a in a DC neighborhood when he was walking home late at night. And the narrative from the police in response to his death was that it was a botched robbery. However, it's recognized that none of his possessions were taken during this alleged botched robbery. There have been many allegations, and there have been counter allegations around his death. And a lot of the news reports that frame discussion of Seth Rich as a conspiracy theory inevitably focus on drama surrounding Texas money manager Ed Butowski. They neglect to focus on statements by Assange and by former UK ambassador Craig Murray, who have both stated that the DNC and Podesta emails were leaks. They've suggested, especially Craig Murray has suggested, that there are multiple sources. So there is the possibility that, perhaps Seth Rich was a source of the DNC emails, and perhaps not the only source of the DNC emails, but that the Podesta emails would have come from a separate source. They were given to WikiLeaks in September, allegedly, and they were published in October, which is obviously long after Seth Rich had unfortunately died. Currently, there have been many statements that are very interesting from a number of people. Award-winning journalist Seth Rich was recorded by Ed Butowski talking about a federal investigation into Seth Rich's death, and alleging again, and this was a recording that was off the record and not recorded with his consent, but he was recorded stating that Seth Rich was the source of the DNC emails, that he'd used a Dropbox and all these things. And then after that recording was published, Cy Hirsch walked back completely on all those allegations. Similarly, Ellen Ratner was basically recorded on video suggesting that a political enemy of Hillary was the source of these emails, not Russia, shortly after she had a conversation with Julian Assange. And she then walked that back completely and basically totally countered her own story. So you have all different people who give some sort of allegation that Seth Rich was the source, and then they walk it back. It's a form of censorship that then you see paralleled in the fact that websites like Medium have actually scrubbed their any articles that were on the site that had Seth Rich's name in the title, really. So you see a lot of censorship, whether it's people walking their allegations back, whether it's articles being completely scrubbed, or whether it's the kind of news media flooding your search results when you look up Seth Rich with, it's a conspiracy theory, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that. So the scrubbing from the people that, or the walking back, I guess, is the part that do you have a sense of why somebody like Cy Hirsch would walk that back? Or do you just not know? I mean, I was wondering if it's one thing or another, fear or...
Yeah. We don't have evidence to really establish what Cy Hirsch or anybody else's motive is, but I think it's fair to say a couple of things. One would be that, like WikiLeaks, Cy Hirsch, wants to keep sources protected, and it's very possible that in the wake of that recorded conversation being publicized, that the source he was working with, that he mentions in the interview or in the recording, was spooked and basically cut communications. It's possible that he could have worked on a story, but the publication of that recording kind of just nipped it in the bud, and so he was forced kind of to drop it in order to protect his source and to protect himself as he's trying to work further as a journalist. And there's also the possibility that there are threats going around. There's a lot of litigation around this topic. Seth Rich's family have been extremely litigious. There are a lot of lawsuits in regards to all of this. So there may be multiple reasons that people want to kind of stay silent or walk their allegations back.
And in this election season, again, like you said, if you try to search his name, pretty much everything you get says it's a conspiracy theory. So it's very hard to trace even the story itself as it existed in the first place. And so it seems as though, I mean, perhaps it's the DNC that wants to erase it, or perhaps it's some other erasure, but it's very hard to follow that story and make any sense of it right now. So do you have anything else you want to say about the Seth Rich story? Because, well, if you could tell us just a little bit about where he fitted into the DNC, and then I think we can move to then the emails themselves.
Sure. So he was I believe, a voter expansion director at the DNC at the time of his death. And the allegation is that he would have had access to the DNC emails and may have leaked them from there. There's no telling whether he would have had help with that or from who, but that's basically the allegation. The counter allegation is just to basically focus on this Ed Butowski issue and smear it with basically deflection and confusion, as we said earlier. I think that's about all that I have on Seth Rich, but if there are any other specific questions, I'm happy to expand.
No, I think probably I'm, again, I tried to do a little research just coming into this interview and couldn't find anything. And I couldn't remember a lot either. I mean, I, of course, remembered his murder, and I knew it was very key to the leaking hacking issue. And again, a lot of people say ordinary people may not understand why that is such an important difference. That hacking means that you have to break into it. Leaking is it's voluntarily offered. And that seems to be one of the big issues around this accusation of the Russians. It's sort of, and there seems to be lots of evidence now, very clear evidence, including the evidence from CrowdStrike, that the emails were not hacked. And so they had to have been leaked. And how they were leaked, I guess, the Seth Rich piece certainly still stands as one real possibility.
Absolutely. And the idea that a whistleblower essentially within the Democratic Party could have been, and obviously this isn't factually assertable this time, but the idea that he could have been murdered as a response to whistleblowing is extremely damning. It's very explosive, yes. Obviously. And I also want to just remind listeners that the former UK Ambassador Craig Murray was alleged to have received from an intermediary later in the year, in September, the Podesta emails, which then WikiLeaks published in October. And so he had a primary, kind of access to this whole situation. And he suggested that Assange's comments and WikiLeaks' interest in the Seth Rich case may also not have been because he was indeed a source, but it could have been that they believed that someone may have murdered him, with the motivation being that they did think that he was a source. So somebody could have been mistaken in thinking that Seth Rich was a source and murdered him as a result. So even if he wasn't a source, I think WikiLeaks' interest in the case is really important. It's something people need to remember. And also, when you consider this as a conspiracy theory, which obviously is what the media likes to label it as, the credibility of Assange and WikiLeaks is unmatched. So the idea that, it's a matter of who you're going to listen to and who you're going to give authority and value the testimony of most. Are you going to listen to somebody who had direct access to this case and has an unmatched record of accuracy, or are you going to listen to establishment media?
Right. I think that's a very good point, because I think that that's one of the problems for people in this period of time, is who to trust. And where should they place their trust? And I think you've made a very, very good point about who to listen to on this particular issue. So moving then to the emails themselves, particularly, well, I would like you to tell us who Craig Murray is specifically. You said he received the Podesta emails also, a copy of them, and then of the leaked emails to WikiLeaks, if you could remind people why these emails were so important. You pointed out the Bernie Sanders issue in it. And so if we could talk about that a little bit, why the emails were important, and then how those Podesta emails fitted into other accusations of the DNC before we move to the issues surrounding WikiLeaks.
Sure. So just to answer your first question, Craig Murray is basically a friend of WikiLeaks, and he's also a former UK ambassador, and he is someone who was, again, directly involved with these 2016 publications. He alleged that he met an intermediary near the grounds of American University in September 2016 and was somehow given some of these documents. It's not clear whether all of the Podesta emails were included in that handover, but essentially by October, WikiLeaks began publishing the Podesta emails. And so what you saw was the DNC emails published in July had a lot of suggestions of the DNC sort of conspiring with the Clinton camp and with the media to promote Hillary Clinton at the expense of Bernie Sanders. And then the contents of the Podesta emails go further, and they really confirm those kind of implied and suspicions. It added a lot more evidence to this idea that Sanders was cheated of the nomination. It showed the Clinton camp and the DNC colluding with the media. It showed the Clinton camp not only colluding with the media against Sanders, but actually also elevating Trump, the Clinton camp asking news outlets to give Trump airtime as a Pied Piper candidate. So it was extremely embarrassing for the DNC. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the chair of the DNC at the time that these emails were released, was heavily embarrassed by their contents, and she was forced to step down from her role as chair, to resign as chair days before the DNC convention. There were huge protests at the DNC convention, and these emails were used specifically as well in the DNC fraud lawsuit, in which it was shown that the DNC basically, thought that it had no right, had no responsibility to its donors to be honest about its or neutral, that its rigging of the nomination was protected under the First Amendment, and a host of other just mind-blowing revelations that again were drowned out in the media in the wake of this Russia narrative and allegations. You really didn't hear a lot about the DNC fraud lawsuit or the cheating of Sanders that came from these emails. You heard instead about Trump-Russia collusion, you heard about Russian hacking, and you heard about Russian troll farms.
Right, right. So actually, the idea that the DNC rigged the election from the beginning, that they had a candidate in mind and it didn't matter what actually happened, was sort of at the heart of what the emails were about. And that idea that the DNC was colluding against voters and the campaign and so on, none of that really got out much into the media. I mean, there were some accusations, but they were sort of lightly held. Do you have any feeling about how the Bernie Sanders campaign took that, or how that went on that side? I'm sorry, this is a bit of a sidebar I hadn't
No, it's fine.
thought about, but
yeah, no, I think that it's sad. I think that the Sanders campaign itself and Bernie Sanders himself really failed in his responsibility to his donors and to
yeah,
his supporters. He did not counter Russiagate in any way. He never pointed out that it was being used to drown out the revelation of him having been cheated. He went on the campaign trail for Hillary Clinton, just as he's now doing so for Biden. He never stood up for his supporters by mentioning the DNC fraud lawsuit. He really didn't do a good job, in my opinion, of discussing this. And he also has not basically supported Assange or said anything about Assange being censored and persecuted. But that contrasts with a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who not only protested at the DNC convention, but have gone on to continue to basically criticize the DNC and, point out that without the DNC cheating Sanders, we very likely wouldn't have had Trump. That really it was this revelation that Sanders had been cheated that showed people that not only could we have had a progressive president, but that we were given this Trump, monstrosity by Clinton and the DNC, not only by cheating Sanders, but also by promoting him early in the campaign trail.
And do you have any idea why Sanders himself collapsed so completely, both, as you said, in the last election and in this one? It's as though there was a certain point in this election season where he seemed to just collapse overnight.
It's hard. Again, it's a bit like discussing the intention of Cy Hirsch, in retracting his story. It's really impossible to say for certainly what his experience was, or why he sort of collapsed in the way that he did. I have the sense that he felt the sense, and this is pure speculation, but I have the sense that he felt that he could at least try to get some progressive progress made in a role where maybe the DNC wouldn't be against him quite as severely as they would have been had he really gone to fight on the ground against Hillary Clinton and the DNC cheating him. I think that's a huge miscalculation.
Yes, it has.
Still see the media just berating Bernie at every turn. So it really doesn't seem to have paid off for his supporters. And I think it's a really disappointing decision. There are allegations out there that perhaps he was threatened, perhaps he's, blackmailed. We don't have any evidence to establish what his motivations are, but regardless of what they are, the net result has been that it's really not served his supporters. I mean, he gathered over $200 million in grassroots support in 2016. And what happened to that money? This was coming from people who were struggling to make their rent, to pay for food. It was coming from homeless people. In my own experience, I know people in my life who could not afford to donate, and yet they did anyway. And so, in that sense, I think Bernie really did severely fail the people that he inspired.
I agree with you completely on that. And I think we're going to have to kind of shift gears out of that, but it is a big and very disappointing mystery. So the next level then really is the accusations of WikiLeaks and how that came about in the media. I mean, we can see the parts fitting together, but it moves from accusing WikiLeaks and then into suspicions about Putin and Russia. And then that's where the media tend to stay for the rest of the election season, and of course into this one as well. So if you can help us kind of make that move.
Sure. Yeah, it's really it is mind-boggling, and I think that's part of it. That I believe that's intentional. And I'm not saying that like one person is architecting this confusion. But I do think that it is intentional, that there is such a volume of reports that are sometimes conflicting, they're contradictory, they don't stand up to real, they don't stand up to real investigation, but the quantity of them just drowns out any real skeptical discussion. So first you have this allegation about Guccifer 2 being a source for the DNC emails, and then you have just this idea that Assange is working for Russia. Later on, it turns into this Trump-Russia collusion narrative, which then is investigated by Mueller along with the hacking allegations. But what I noticed as I was following this as an independent journalist is that every time an article or an outlet would debunk an aspect of Russiagate, whether it was hacking in Guccifer 2 or the Trump-Russia collusion narrative, the media would deftly switch and deflect from that debunking to the other aspects. So you'd kind of see a switch between the Trump-Russia collusion narrative and the DNC, the Russian hacking narrative. And anytime one of those was debunked, they would switch to the other foot. And I thought that was really interesting. But essentially, you have this morphing of the Guccifer 2 issue over to the Steele dossier through the Mueller report, which was a total failure. And then you have most recently, actually, you have this revelation that FBI agents who were actually very, very concerned with this, with this investigation being basically a chasing down of conspiracy theories, specifically in reference to Mike Flynn. But it's been an absolute mess. It's been very convoluted. And I think there have been a lot of really great reporters out there chasing it down, whether it's the people at Consortium News and, people like former CIA analyst Ray McGovern have done a great job covering this from beginning to end. You also have Aaron Mate from The Nation doing a fantastic job, specifically with calling out a lot of the Mueller investigation and the report from him.
So let's just trace one little piece of this again that you mentioned that I want to make sure that people understand. That the DNC tried to put Trump in place first because they thought he could be easily defeated, I assume. And then when he actually won the election, that was probably an unthinkable result for them. And so then they switched gears on the I think that they switched gears only to the degree that they got more serious about saying, well, it really was Russia that elected Trump. And so if you could just help trace this theme where the DNC wants Trump to be the candidate, then it's unthinkable and amazing that he got elected. And then they shift almost immediately to investigating Russia and this hacking as actually the reason why he was elected. And so, it's like we're in this whirlwind then of accusations about Trump and not even understanding or being able to analyze the election because the accusations take over any real analysis of what happened that he beat Hillary Clinton and so on. So if you can just kind of bring us through that and then up to the Senate report on the Mueller investigation, and then we're kind of up to date on this part of it.
Sure. Well, again, you have the DNC hacking story, Russian hacking the DNC story. And I'd like to add, because I failed to mention it earlier, but basically the only evidence of any hack, which you quoted Ray McGovern earlier in debunking, CrowdStrike's allegations from CrowdStrike themselves, but that was revealed late in the game. Through the 2 or 3 years of Russiagate, the Russiagate real furor, you had people quoting CrowdStrike. The intelligence agencies that assessed the situation were only able to review basically third-party information from CrowdStrike, including a redacted draft report. It was just completely ridiculous. But nonetheless, you have this huge media firestorm around Russian hacking initially, in 2016. Mostly, as I said, mostly to kind of, it seems, muddy the water around the WikiLeaks publications. At that time, as you bring up, they weren't really going after Trump at that point. It was more about deflecting from and smearing the WikiLeaks publications in order to protect Hillary Clinton, one would say. And then as soon as Trump does win the election, you have this Steele dossier that appears out of nowhere that was authored by a former MI6 agent steal. And then you have the basically, I mean, it was not difficult to debunk that dossier, but that's where the firestorm really begins around Trump Russia. The allegations that Trump was basically a Putin puppet that was being blackmailed by this salacious content of this dossier. And then you move forward to basically further Trump-Russia collusion allegations that kind of mushroom out from the dossier. Once the dossier is debunked, new allegations and new very much debunkable threads emerge that really have not stood up to scrutiny over time.
And so how much money did taxpayers put into the Mueller investigation? Can you remind us, do you know approximately?
I can give an approximate number. I'm not sure the exact amount, but I believe it was between 100 and 200 million dollars. If I hope that that's correct. I'm not exactly sure on the specific number there, but it was a significant amount of taxpayer money. And I don't want to say liberal media because I'm not conservative. I consider myself a progressive, but the establishment media really did seem to portray Robert Mueller as kind of a saint figure, a savior figure who was going to, oust Trump from office and save the country from this fascist dictator. And in reality, Mueller was really unable to prove anything in his report. He didn't. Was not able. He kind of alleged that the Russian government had been responsible for interfering via social media, which was completely debunked. You have allegations of the DNC hack, again via Guccifer 2, completely debunked. And then later, as you mentioned earlier, we have this Senate Intelligence Committee report that kind of enhances Mueller's report, but really doesn't provide any new evidence whatsoever.
And so I wanted to just quote the piece by James Risen that came out in The Intercept on September 3rd, because it seemed like, and up until this report, I hadn't really followed everything by Risen, but he seemed to be very much of a critic of and a whistleblower on the CIA, and somebody who I guess I would trust. And The Intercept is an independent news outlet that I also follow. And he seemed to have lauded the Senate report. For example, he wrote that the Senate report goes much further than election interference and provides the first detailed examination of the broader and complex network of relationships between Trump, his ever-shifting circle of personal and business associates, and a series of Russian oligarchs and other Russian and Ukrainian figures with ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. In the process, the report provides badly needed context for the events of 2016 and beyond. Above all, it reveals the true nature of the counterintelligence threat posed by a president willing and eager to accept the help of a foreign adversary to win American elections. So help us understand why James Risen is writing this, and Ray McGovern says something very different, and so do you, about the Senate report. So what happened there?
Well, I think, unfortunately, what I've witnessed of James Risen's journalism is that it seems to have taken a turn for the worse in the wake of the Russiagate issue. You've had some great reporting at The Intercept by Glenn Greenwald that's been factually based and skeptical on Russiagate. But Risen seems to have really, for lack of a better way of putting it, I think he's really become a victim of something like, sort of Trump derangement syndrome, where the facts don't matter. The emotion of the hatred towards Trump, fear of Trump, really seems to have hijacked a lot of the critical thinking capacity of multiple journalists that have otherwise been respectable and really fact-based and responsible. I will add, though, that the Intercept is not a perfect outlet. Although it published the amazing Snowden revelations, it's also taken the Snowden file archive down in recent years. So there are a lot, there are some issues with the Intercept, but I think that really it's a sad development in terms of James Risen's journalism and the way he's discussed this. And if you look at the quote that you just read, you know, even Risen doesn't have any specific evidence. He says, you know, he describes it as an ever-shifting circle,
Yeah.
you know, complex network. That's very, very vague, and it doesn't have any teeth. There's no evidence in it. So
Right.
basically, you know, he says it's context, and he just basically sums it up as a counterintelligence threat. You know, again, that says to me that he's operating from a place of emotion rather than factuality, and I think that's a real shame.
So, you know, you mentioned the Trump derangement syndrome, and I've certainly seen lots of evidence of this syndrome among my friends, you know, about among people that I listen to, podcasters that I listen to. I don't quite get it. So this is the part that I don't get. Trump was somebody who was not supposed to have defeated Hillary, but he did. And he's got some very loyal followers who constitute a sort of large group, let's say, of the American population. Why are the people on the other side not more interested in what actually is happening? I mean, why are they so focused on just going after Trump? I heard Bernie Sanders on the Bill Maher show the other night, and it was very disappointing because he said very little about anything in the Democratic platform. The only thing he talked about, and the only thing that Bill Maher talked about, was just how awful Trump is, how he's going to hold on to office even if he's defeated. We have to get him out of there. He's a nutcase. Well, we need to get him out in any possible way. And in fact, one of the other reporters on stage said, well, hey, maybe we need to defeat him first. You know, it's as though there is kind of I'm not even sure what it is, and it's interesting to think of the idea that the DNC first had him in mind as an ideal candidate to be defeated by Hillary. And then he actually defeats Hillary, so maybe he drives everybody crazy then, like, how did this happen? But there's no real analysis of what's going on with all of these people who follow him and how they're thinking and how the other side should respond to that. Instead, all of that is let go of. And this Russiagate thing comes in, the Mueller investigation, and then the investigation of that investigation, and then all sorts of 17 intelligence agencies who agree with all of this stuff. It's as though there's some kind of syndrome where people are kind of losing their mind or their capacity to think about things. And so I wonder if you have any sort of take on that and why it holds so many sort of major media outlets, you know, just in thrall, is this Trump derangement syndrome.
Well, I think there are actually a number of really interesting points that kind of connect in explaining this phenomenon. I think one of them is that it reminds me a lot of not only Trump's role in WWE, where he would, you know, come out as this heel. It's like his presidency to me is a lot like that. And instead of, you know, inflaming a WWE audience, he's inflaming, you know, the media and the people who follow the media. And I think that, but what that serves though, it serves as kind of a 1984-esque, you know, 2-minute hate. It serves as a venting of all of this rage that otherwise might be vented at the system itself that gave us Trump, and they don't want that. Also, it helps TV ratings to focus on the latest Trump gaffe or statement or whatever. And I think a big reason that such a huge, you know, furor is made about Trump as well as a personality is that persona, and not only because it's sort of you know, crude, but it's an outsider to politics. I mean, Trump isn't a Joe Biden who spent 40 years in Congress and whatever else. It's that Trump is, as you say, supported by people who are not in the Beltway, that he is an outsider politically. And there's this classist mentality of disgust, I think, too, that if you consider yourself kind of an maybe upper class progressive person, that there's this disdain and disgust towards Trump and the people who would support him that I think is really not only looking down on people that do support Trump, but also leads one to alienate anyone who just doesn't support Biden or Hillary in trying to go against Trump. So if you have a problem with the Democratic Party and the system that gave us Trump, then you're a traitor to the blue no matter who kind of cause. And it really is bizarre and self-defeating, because you would think that if you really wanted to defeat Trump, you would be trying to reach out to people who supported Sanders, or whoever, Tulsi Gabbard, these other people, that you would be trying to make alliances and get a larger groundswell of support, when all the Democratic Party seems to do is really attack people who are outside of that, like Biden supporting or Hillary supporting conglomerate. And I think so. And in addition to that, I think a big factor in the whole Trump derangement syndrome kind of issue is also, that I've seen personally, is that when people have their primary news sources as CNN, MSNBC, and other cable news networks that really go on the attack at Trump every single day, they get very limited information. They seem to be very, very scared and very much emotionally kind of destabilized by the coverage that they're consuming. And they really don't know much about all of this origin of Russiagate, whether it's the collusion or the DNC hacking. They really do seem to be underinformed. However, none of that is to say that Trump is in any way like a good president or a good choice or anything like that. But I think, ultimately, the most jaded reading of this situation is that the media profits from Trump derangement syndrome, because people are glued to their televisions. They're glued to the Washington Post to read, what they should be afraid of next. So for one thing, and also it provides a smokescreen for the DNC to not actually change and not provide a candidate that would really be suitable and really supported by its base. So I think it's actually in the DNC's interest and the media's interest for Trump to be reelected. So it's not surprising to me that you have somebody who is as much of a failed candidate as Biden is running, because if they allow Trump to win again, despite their screaming to the contrary, they'll be able to scream Russia for another 4 years instead of actually changing their platform to an acceptable one. And the media will be allowed to scream Russiagate rather than cover, which would be a whole lot more profit-inducing than things returning to business as usual with Biden as a president.
But it would also be very endangering of lots of us, and in lots of situations, which I want to move on to. But I wanted to say something about what you were saying about disgust and disdain, because, among other things, I've been very interested in the issues surrounding moral superiority and what motivates people, particularly in political conversations, to feel morally superior to each other. And, disgust is a primary emotion. We're born with it. And it's, of course, a movement away. The infant moves away from something that's toxic and actually turns away from that. Now, that motivation is our motivation for moral development. And it ends up being used in the development of our sense of morality. However, if it's used in a very primitive way, like in the Trump derangement syndrome, what it motivates is dehumanization, not simply disagreement, not even hatred. Hatred and disagreement are still humanized. We still can talk to the other person, the other human being. But if you're actually motivated by disgust and disdain, the other person actually is dehumanized. And at that point, you don't mind seeing his head on the stake, because that person is no longer really a human being. And I'm afraid that many people moving in this sort of circle about Trump actually prefer to see him and his followers as dehumanized, instead of looking at them sort of as people who are on the other side of some issue that needs to be worked out through some kind of dialogue, some kind of engagement. So I think it's a dangerous aspect of the current situation that we're in, and that it is built to some degree around this movement that happened in the DNC, into the Guccifer 2, the Russians, and then, how terrible, how awful. We got this, we elected somebody that wasn't really elected. It was the Russians who wanted him from the beginning, and we have to get rid of him because of that. And of course, as you say, Trump has been playing the heel from the time he was in his campaign. He was playing, and he knows that role, and he knows how it works on the audience. And I think he's done that perfectly well. And again, the media don't seem to be concerned about either the effects that he's having or this kind of polarization that leads to dehumanization or anything that might come out of those conditions. And as you said, I agree. I think the DNC would, they could have run somebody other than Biden, and there were many candidates that were very capable. And in this environment, they ended up with Biden, which just seems peculiar. It seems like it's a setup for Trump, actually.
Exactly.
And yeah, and then I wonder, how that leads into suspicions of Russians and the possibilities of all sorts of things, which we'll get to. But I want to just kind of take a step back here and see if we can bring this back to, what we can glean from all of this distortion that was hidden and prompted in regard to how we should think about Russia. What can we glean about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and where we are right now in this extradition hearing? I don't see myself how all these pieces fit together. I know the prosecution changed their tune at the last minute about what they're actually prosecuting in the extradition hearing. I wonder if you can tell us how Julian Assange and WikiLeaks fits into these issues that we're talking about, the media sort of setting up something where it seems likely Trump will be reelected. It seems likely we're meant to think that the Russians are behind all of this, and we're meant to think something about the Russians and about Putin. So can you kind of fit the WikiLeaks piece in for us?
Sure, and I'll just add one last comment about Trump derangement syndrome, and that is that I think it's very sad that the entire syndrome itself and all of the media creating it, fueling it, what it hides as well is just that Trump, as a presidency, has essentially, when you really look at his actions and not his kind of not flowery, but a kind of flamboyant rhetoric, you see that his presidency has been business as usual, whether that's on,
yes,
domestically and in terms of foreign policy. So that's the last thing I wanted to say on that. But in terms of WikiLeaks and Assange and his current extradition hearing, we don't expect a final kind of ruling to come down on that until early 2021. That's the latest from Judge Baretzer on Magistrate Judge Baretzer on that.
So after the election.
Exactly. And see, the election, the fact that it's political and that the election is important in this case was actually brought up recently and acknowledged by Vanessa Baretzer. So I think that's really fascinating. And in the terms of the extradition treaty between the United States and the UK preclude any extradition that is regarding a politically motivated or political offense. So basically, it should be thrown out from day one. The fact that it's not is really disappointing. But what's ironic about the entire extradition process that's happening now with Assange is that the Obama administration did not prosecute Assange, did not indict Assange for these espionage offenses because the Obama administration recognized the danger it would pose to the press. What happened allegedly, what the defense have argued throughout this extradition hearing, is that the Trump administration allegedly sent an envoy to the embassy, I believe in early 2017, saying that if Assange, and basically offering Assange a pardon in return for disproving Russiagate by disclosing the sources for the 2016 publications. So that's the link there. But so when Assange refused to do so because he's extremely has an extreme level of integrity when it comes to protecting sources. Again, I mean, WikiLeaks is not only unmatched in its accuracy and integrity and the truthfulness of the documents that it's published for 10 years, it's also unmatched in protecting its sources. You see a lot of outlets that have tried to sort of imitate WikiLeaks, again, returning to The Intercept. The Intercept has burned sources multiple times, most famously recently Reality Winner, who's in prison because of a really bad mistake by Intercept reporters in printing in sending the printout that they received from Reality Winner to the authorities, which then resulted in her arrest. So basically, returning to Assange and this offer of a pardon, even after years in the embassy with deteriorating health, with the, given the offer of a pardon, he refused to do so. He refused to disclose sources. And as a result, the defense have alleged the Trump administration then basically went after Assange full bore. They basically went full bore against him and decided to prosecute him, and but obviously not in relation to 2016, but in relation to the 2010 publications of the Manning era. So what's really important to take away from that is you have Trump, who is supposed to have been aided and installed by WikiLeaks, acting on the behalf of Putin. You have Assange being prosecuted by Trump, the same person he's supposed to have helped elect via Putin.
Right.
So it's like the hearing itself, the facts of the hearing itself really also serve to debunk Russiagate and go against the idea that, this is some grand conspiracy between Putin, Assange, and Trump.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So just to remind people that Barraster is the judge, and she does not seem to be conducting a very fair hearing. And do you know why that's the case, or what's happening there?
I think that it's fair to say that Barraster would get a lot of political and job benefits for streamlining and allowing the extradition of Assange to the United States. It's fair to say that she would not have a very good outcome if she did not allow that. It's been interesting to hear that she seems to have slightly softened towards the defense a tiny amount in the last week or so of the hearing. She has, at one point, she threatened to remove Assange if he spoke out in court again. He later then stood up to defend Khalid al-Masri, who was a CIA victim of torture, who was completely innocent and basically kidnapped by mistake. Assange stood up in court to defend him, and Barraster told him to sit down and be quiet, but did not throw him out of court as she had threatened to do. We had John Pilger on CN Live 2 weeks ago stating that basically he felt that there was a tiny glimmer of hope because the defense was doing a very effective job. That basically, if there was any real justice in this case, that the extradition would not be allowed to go forward. That does not mean that it won't. It doesn't mean that the defense will be successful. But at this time, it seems like they're doing a very effective job if you pay attention to what they're saying and you pay attention to the proceedings in totally debunking the United States government's case against Assange, and by extension, the UK prosecutor's case against him. The problem, though, is that the access to the courtroom is extremely limited. Amnesty International and Reporters Without Borders have been completely barred from accessing the proceedings, whether in person or via Zoom link or hearing over the internet. But the point is that it's been not only difficult for people to access it at all, it's also been plagued by technical difficulties where we've had problems hearing what witnesses are saying, hearing what the lawyers are saying. The technical difficulties at one point resulted in Kevin Gostola, a brilliant journalist from Shadowproof, who's been listening to the hearings via the internet, basically kicked out via technical difficulties and not allowed back in for the rest of the day. So you have a lack of access, a lack of transparency in this case that is not simply, present in the arguments themselves, but also in the ability of the public to hear the case. In addition to that, the people that are those members of the legacy press that are able to cover it have really not covered it almost at all. The establishment media has completely failed in its responsibility to cover this case. So the public is not hearing the damning evidence against the government's allegations. They're not hearing the real proceedings. And that is a huge shame. I think that's the biggest danger, the biggest reason that it's very, very likely that Assange will be extradited is because the public just won't know what a travesty this hearing has been.
And so you said you felt that the judge's sort of feelings or attitude towards the defense had changed recently.
Slightly.
Do you think that that's one reason why the delay has taken place till after the election? I mean, what can you just say what her reasoning was to ask for this delay so that also the defense could prepare materials, which she had refused earlier to do?
Right.
So why did she change her mind?
Well, I think it's interesting, but I believe the prosecutors and the defense are both going to submit final arguments via written format, which is really a shame because it's not known at this time, to my knowledge, whether those written final arguments will even be able to be accessed by the public in the way that we've been able to hear the hearing so far. So I believe, my understanding is that Beretzer has allowed this break in order for the defense and the prosecution to prepare those written arguments, and also because she acknowledged that the case will be affected by what administration comes into the White House. That if Trump is reelected, it will be one thing, and if Biden is elected, it will be quite another thing. So I think there's two basic premises. It's one, so that the lawyers can prepare these written arguments, and secondarily, so that they can see who is in office, because that will affect the outcome of the trial. And I think that the fact that she even recognized that is huge. If there was real justice in this, it would result in her throwing out the case entirely, but that's probably very much not likely. And unfortunately, I think despite maybe a slight softening in her attitude, it's very unlikely that represents a real change in what we'll see as an outcome, unfortunately.
And what do you think would happen to Assange if there were a Biden administration, if Biden gets elected?
Well, I think that, again, unfortunately, while Trump seems to have really gone after Assange in a way that the Obama administration was unwilling to, Biden has also called Assange a high-tech terrorist, I believe, that his words were something to that effect. And so I think that Biden would be just as ferocious in going after Assange, although it's just indefensible to go after him based on these 2010 publications and for doing what any good journalist does. But at the same time, it would also be impossible to prosecute him for the DNC and Podesta emails in the 2016 publications, because nothing illegal whatsoever was done there either. So I think that although it is a political case, I do think that whether Trump or Biden are in office in 2021, that it will not be a good outcome for Assange.
And I noticed that in the letter that was signed by over 100 heads of state, politicians, and so on, I think there were only 2 Americans that signed that letter, that the case should be dropped. And one was Ron Paul, and the other one was, who was the other? Gary, I've forgotten his last name. Right? No, not Gary Johnson. No, I just can't remember. But there were only 2. There were only 2 Americans, and I was amazed that Bernie's name wasn't on there. So I mean, it was another indication that Bernie actually has slipped right out of the positions that he was taking earlier for whatever reason. Maybe just that the Democratic establishment is so powerful that you can't actually operate independently. So.
Well, that's exactly the conclusion that was reached by the DNC fraud lawsuit attorney Jared Beck. He wrote a great book titled "What Happened to Bernie Sanders," and basically a play on Hillary Clinton's book "What Happened." But basically, Beck concludes that one is just not going to be able to mount a successful progressive campaign from within the DNC. The DNC has, as a party, has structured its own rules, its own internal proceedings to such an extent that anyone who is a progressive and a populist progressive will be locked out of the nomination. And I think Sanders is a really exemplary, example of that. He's a perfect example of that.
A part of the reason why I'm doing these interviews at all, these interviews on Pay Attention, is because I feel that there's been such a difficulty in trying to discern anything about the truth, looking at media, looking at the government, many things that are going on, everything from, issues surrounding COVID to issues surrounding the election to the social uprising and so on. And it's as though we've moved so far away from transparency that people can't even imagine being able to deal with either of these political parties and have anything that seems to make sense. I mean, every time, you think, well, maybe something makes sense here, like maybe Bernie Sanders is making sense. And then things are turned and twisted in a way that they don't make sense anymore. And it seems that we're so far away from being able to operate with any kind of trust or transparency in our political framework that I don't find a lot that's hopeful in the immediate future. And then I do find a lot that is concerning. And that's why I want to turn to the issues about Russia and the potential for a nuclear threat also. But do you have anything to say about hopefulness? I mean, how do you feel about it?
No, I actually, I wrote an article quite a while ago about the death of hope being necessary for an American awakening. And my point there was that hope is what fuels, narratives like QAnon. It's what fuels people to support Sanders even after he's, endorsed Biden and endorsed Hillary Clinton and all this type of thing. It's something that is used in a really Machiavellian way by politicians. And I think that people really have to let that hope die and look at the facts as they stand in order to emancipate themselves from this system as we have it. And I think without that, all you're going to do is see different varieties of, for lack of a better term, hope porn being peddled by different sources for different audiences, whether it's right wing or left wing. And I think that we have to let go of those sources and those narratives in order to really look at reality as it is. I think that, the issue about finding the truth at the heart of all of these narratives, whether it's the Epstein story or Russiagate or any other issue that's in the political sphere, what I see over and over again is that not only are there lies of omission, like in the Epstein case, as I said earlier, but there are also just reams and reams of contradictory and flimsy lies that are repeated over and over again, which is, famously, the biggest lie you can tell will work if you just say it over and over again, that quote, but also the quantity of confusion, the amount of confusion that those contradictory stories create is really an end result that is desired, I think, by people who want to keep the system, the status quo as it is. James Douglas wrote a fantastic book on JFK titled JFK and the Unspeakable. And I bring that up because that was really the book that opened my eyes to the way that confusion is used as a tool and confusion is an end goal when intelligence agencies or media want to obscure the truth. That you don't even have to tell, in other words, you don't have to tell a convincing lie to obscure the truth. You just have to confuse people that are trying to find the truth. So that's why, we can spend 2 hours talking about Russiagate and we will have barely scratched the factual surface of the allegations themselves, much less the evidence debunking those allegations. And that's why I think it can be summed up as, confusion being a tool of deceit, because it's just such a large quantity of information. I mean, we could spend days talking about it and not get through it all.
Well, I like everything you've just said, but I particularly like that term, hope porn. I never thought of it before. He said, for lack of a better term, but that's a pretty good term. And yes, there is a kind of hope porn as people peddle whatever it is that they're sponsoring in terms of the system. And also the nature of truth is actually to clarify confusion. So truth aligns with reality. When there isn't any truth, there's more and more confusion. So you don't even necessarily, after a while, have to peddle confusion. You just have to peddle things that don't quite clarify the truth, and people remain more and more confused. And so that, I think, is the situation that we're in, sadly. And then there's this additional danger of a nuclear threat in regard to Russia. And again, something that I think can be understood if you really just, pause for a moment and look at the fact that the wars that the US is involved in right now are never reported. People know really very little about them. And I wanted to then come back to the issues that kind of integrate the concerns with Russiagate, the Trump election, where we are right now in this election season, with the potentials for a nuclear war with Russia. Because again, this is so large an issue that I don't think people can kind of get it all at once. But I've learned about this way of thinking by studying Stephen Cohen's work on the current Cold War that we're in with Russia. And Stephen Cohen, who was a renowned American scholar on Russia and an authority on US-Russian relations, died recently of cancer at the age of 81. And among other things he pointed out was that we have been in a Cold War with Russia, at least since the Obama presidency and maybe since the Bush presidency, and that both political parties seem to support that war. In regard to current threats involving Russia, he says, in the 1970s and 1980s, advocates of détente were well organized, well funded, and well represented, from grassroots politics and universities to think tanks, mainstream media, Congress, the State Department, and even the White House. Today, there is no such opposition anywhere. And then he warns, we have 3 Cold War fronts that are fraught with the possibility of hot war. In the Baltic region, where NATO is carrying out an unprecedented military buildup on Russia's border. In the Ukraine, where there is a civil and proxy war between Russia and the West. And of course, in Syria, where Russian aircraft and American warplanes are flying in the same territory. Anything could happen. And he goes on to say that détente with Russia has always been fiercely opposed as a policy pursuit in the US, but one that is manifestly in the best interests of our country and the whole world. Last year, Cohen wrote, no American president can achieve détente without substantial bipartisan support at home, which Trump manifestly lacks. So please bring us up to date on the nuclear threat and current wars that are fueled by the media's emphasis on what Cohen has called a mindless response to Trump's pledge to cooperate with Russia.
Well, that is a powerful set of quotes from Cohen, and I share your sadness at his death. He was a fantastic journalist. I think that first, it's really sad and a little bit ironic that the establishment media and the Beltway politicians will show basically bipartisan support when Trump wants to do anything that expands war, expands the military-industrial kind of complex. You know, when he wants to give, make $100 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, it's all wonderful. But when he wants to bring troops out of Syria, then all hell breaks loose. So basically what I'm saying is that when Trump wants to increase defense spending or anything like that, he has bipartisan support from the Democrats, Republicans, and from the press, it seems. Whenever he goes against that initiative, it's, he's very harshly attacked, and it's really been an unsuccessful attempt on his part to kind of bring troops in from Syria, from Afghanistan, etc. I think also, as other journalists have pointed out, it is very dangerous in terms of a nuclear threat that the political scenario in the United States, the political culture in the United States has forced Trump to be so defensive, and they've really pushed him to prove that he's not a Russian puppet by going hard against Russia, by doing things that are against Putin's interest. So even just this allegation, whether it's false or not, about Russia and Putin, really does escalate tensions between the two countries in an extremely dangerous way, all basically in order to have Trump prove that he's not a Russian puppet. I mean, to have the nuclear threat escalated to that extent based on false and provably false allegations is mind-blowing. It's absolutely unbelievable. And as you say, there is not that kind of hesitance that you saw in the 1970s and 80s, and there's not the public awareness of the danger. Right now, as opposed to the Cold War 1.0, you don't have the public consciousness really aware of things like a doomsday clock or the ticking threat of this and an iron curtain and all of that. Right now, it's not only an absence of that kind of criticism of a hawkish stance. Instead, if you criticize Russiagate, if you support WikiLeaks, if you basically do anything except kind of go along with this Trump derangement syndrome echo chamber, then you're labeled a Putin puppet, a Russian troll on Twitter. You may be censored by social media platforms, or you may be censored by your own media outlet, depending on who you write for. There's really a shutting down of discourse, not just in terms of Trump Russia and Russiagate itself, but also in terms of this anti-war issue. So it means that if you even try to bring up things that conflict with the echo chamber of Trump Russia derangement syndrome, you'll be silenced, which means there is, as you say, almost no opposition, as Cohen pointed out, and almost no opposition to this new Cold War.
And so where's that going? Like, what's the point? I mean, are we just beating the drums towards this kind of, inevitable sort of nuclear midnight, or what? It seems that this campaign against Russia, and as you said, in a similar way to Bernie Sanders, Trump had some points to make that were independent of the political establishment. Most of those things he's totally collapsed on because he's had so much opposition, not just from his opponents in the government, but also from the media. So he's collapsed. He hasn't gone forward with ways that he might have led the country into a better place. And it seems as though we're just going in one direction, which is towards some sort of nuclear catastrophe. Is that what's wanted? I mean, or are people just not paying attention? Or do you have any sense of, it doesn't to me make any sense that there's no war opposition party in an imperialistic country that is at war with lots and lots of places and peoples at this moment, and we're in a presidential election. I don't get it.
Yeah, and the fact that this isn't brought up during the presidential election, that
Right.
nobody's talking about it, that obviously Biden and Kamala Harris are not talking about it,
Not
much less the media that supports them. I think it's shameful, and I also think that I hope that it's not the intention to kind of push things until we see a nuclear catastrophe. I don't think it makes as you say, it makes no sense that would be a desired outcome, because it's just that nobody wins in that outcome. So my only logical conclusion around that subject is that it's not intentional, that the nuclear war would not be the intended outcome, but it seems that that those that are pushing this narrative are either ignoring that threat, or they think that it's manageable, that they can push Russia, they can push against it without that being an outcome, whether an accidental outcome or otherwise. However, there's no guarantee that it won't. And I really hope that that's not the case, but I think that there is at minimum, there is a gross underestimation of the danger by military figures, by the people in politics that are pushing Trump, Russiagate, the Russiagate issue, and also by observers in the media who basically, although, as you say, Trump has collapsed in a lot of his campaign kind of gusto and promises and all of this, what that's meant, as you kind of imply, is that it really has been business as usual. There really hasn't been a lot of deviation in Trump's presidency. And nonetheless, you have people just absolutely hysterical at his presidency, conflating a business as usual presidency guised in the persona of a Trump heel as a greater threat, as a greater existential threat to democracy in the United States and to the world than nuclear war.
Yes,
and I
exactly.
think that,
Exactly.
I don't know how to explain that exactly, or how to even surmise what would really be the outcome moving forward. All I can say is basically what you've said, which is that it is just unbelievable.
Yeah. I think you've put it really precisely, that it seems as though within this derangement, the derangement syndrome, that people really don't care about a nuclear war. They just want to promote the Trump-Russia syndrome or the Trump-Russia case, and they just want Trump off the scene. And as you said as well, the business as usual kind of position that we've seen with Trump, that we've seen with Bernie Sanders, really does make me wonder, is it possible for anyone to be outside of the business as usual within our overall sort of, political electoral landscape? And the answer is probably not. But what makes that shift? And are we headed for some major catastrophe because there don't seem to be many realistic choices about what to do? And I deeply hope that that is not going to happen. And yet I think that often things look pretty bleak on the
Yes.
immediate horizon. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that it's interesting. I think that I agree that it's very, very unlikely that anybody who really represents the kind of change that the vast majority of Americans want will be able to get into office or be effective in any way, even if they were able to get into office, whether it's
Right.
in Congress or in the presidency. Even people like AOC, will make a really big stink, validly so, about the response to the COVID crisis. But she'll point out that there's the stimulus response is trillions of dollars going to the 1%, but then she'll vote for it anyway. So
Yeah.
it's like, even those who are screaming against this type of thing are having to go along with it if they're in politics. So in other words, I agree that it's not possible, it seems, for change to come from the political arena. I think we can all agree that the political arena represents corporate power, it represents money, and it represents the military. It does not represent the voters, which is going off tangent of this discussion, but I think that's a premise through which you can understand why, one of the reasons why, that you will not see change that represents the public in a positive way. Instead, you're just seeing more and more and more wealth transfer from the public, from the vast majority to the minority, kind of like 1%. In response to that, I think we're already seeing the response to that. After Bernie Sanders was apparently, for all intents and purposes, cheated a second time from the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party as a Democratic Party candidate, we had COVID, and we've had the protests as a result of George Floyd's death. I think that part of the fuel behind those protests, in my opinion, are two things: the economic fallout from the COVID crisis, where people are unable to pay rent, they're unable to have an income, they're in real economic crisis, and their one avenue for help would have been somebody like Bernie Sanders. So having that taken away from them meant that there was a vast number of people who are in huge distress, who have no outlet. And I think now that is one reason that you're seeing these protests that have intensified. And I think that if business as usual continues, that's what we'll see. We'll see protests like this around many different issues. But one of the core reasons for them is that there is no real representation right now in politics.
That's right. That's right. And I think that that kind of protest also is a civil unrest that may draw out responses from the state. And that is another outcome that wouldn't be in any way, what we would want. The one final piece on this narrative that we're putting together right now about, let's say, the lack of hope, that on the good side, I guess, I think we're speaking truthfully, and there's a relief in speaking truthfully. The other piece of it is the connection between much of media and the intelligence agencies, which we talked about a lot in the last interview on the Epstein case, and I think connects to the way the media have covered this, the issues involving Russiagate, and the way the DNC quoted the 17 intelligence agencies that agreed entirely that the Russians had interfered with our election and blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's some kind of connection that seems to be pretty sewed up between the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and our media, which also then all of that seems to perpetuate the kind of cycle that we've been talking about, in which there is no possibility of really breaking out of the situation that we're in, So that's the one of the other issues.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that I also believe that the fact of discussing and airing truth, especially about unknown or shadow type issues, I believe that is something that in and of itself has value. And I think
Yes.
if people want to retain any hope, and I don't know if hope is the right word, but if there is any hope, it is in that. It is in the airing of truth, no matter how dark that is. And I think that that's what's motivated me as a journalist to talk about these things, knowing full well that I might be censored, or that, you know, maybe nothing tangibly would come of reporting on these things, because I really do believe, as you do, that truth in itself is an end goal, that it has some sort of cathartic and transformative purpose and a real effect. But also I think that, you know, moving forward, and with the entanglement of intelligence agencies with the media, we're seeing it in Russiagate now. We've seen it in the intelligence operatives who have been given platforms to talk about all sorts of issues, whether it's foreign policy, like on MSNBC or on CNN or any of these other outlets, and also to talk about, you know, Assange as if he's a high-tech terrorist and should be assassinated. We've seen it in all these different cases, and not just recently. We also saw it in 2003 with the lead up to the Iraq War. We saw it. We've seen, and we also, it was first really exposed in the 70s in the Church Committee, where the CIA admitted that it had, you know, basically planted stories in the media, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that from the 70s that had been happening, but it really has become so overt in recent years that instead of even kind of just presenting a CIA-backed narrative, these outlets and these cable news channels have actually just had the CIA and intelligence officials just come right on and say whatever it is they want to say unchallenged. So yes, we see it in Russiagate, we see it in the issue of Assange especially as well, and we see it going back decades, unfortunately. And I think that, you know, it goes back to, for me as well, you know, in kind of going against that, what Assange did, and one of his most famous quotes is that if wars are started based on lies, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin or WMD in Iraq and all of that, then peace can be started with truth. And that is something to hold on to. And I, you know, rather than, for me anyway, rather than civil unrest, rather than any other avenue, I think that's the only avenue we have left, is to pursue the truth with everything we've got.
Well, that is a wonderful place to end, and a wonderful place for me to say that I'm very grateful for your work and very grateful to talk to you. I hope to talk to you again, and I agree with you. I think that there is a hope in simply talking about the truth, and also that peace does begin with truth, and people settle down when they actually know the truth. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for talking to me today. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.